Hi all, welcome back. Today's discussion will be on the chapter How do organisms reproduce in plants. We'll be covering this chapter in two parts. The part 1 will include a short introduction on reproduction and its types, and we'll be looking into detail about asexual reproduction in plants. Second part will be dealing with sexual reproduction in plants, which will be our next video. So, what is asexual reproduction? Asexual reproduction involves only one parent, and there is no formation and fusion of gametes. The young ones will be formed almost identical to each other as well as to the parent cell. In unicellular organisms, asexual reproduction can be taken place in three different ways: binary fission, multiple fission, or budding. Let's talk about each in detail. Now let's talk about binary fission. Binary fission is usually seen in bacteria and protozoa like amoeba. In these, the pseudopodia is first withdrawn. Later, the nucleus of the parent cell divides, and then the cytoplasm divides. Finally, the result will be formation of two daughter cells. This is the basic process behind binary fission. The division of cytoplasm is termed as cytokinesis, and the division of nucleus is termed as karyokinesis. This binary fission occurs during highly favorable conditions. Let's now talk about budding. This is usually seen in Hydra. The parent Hydra will develop a bud at its lower end. This grows in size and finally breaks off to live independently. This is almost similar to the budding in unicellular organism, except the difference that the bud develops in the lower end. Spore formation. These are seen in Rhizopus, a fungus. Rhizopus body is made up of a thread-like structure called hyphae. The erect hyphae bear sporangia, inside which reproductive structures called spores are formed. These spores are asexually reproducing bodies which have a thick protective wall. They are produced during unfavorable times and help to tide over the unfavorable environmental conditions. When the spores fall on a suitable medium, each one forms a new individual. This tissue culture is a technique of developing new plants from cell or tissue in a nutrient medium under aseptic conditions. The cell or tissue is placed in a nutrient medium where it forms a mass of cells called callus. This callus is then transferred to another nutrient medium where it differentiates and forms a new plant. How do organisms reproduce? Yes, as we have already discussed, we know that organisms can reproduce either asexually or sexually. Asexual reproduction can be either by unicellular organisms or by multicellular organisms. In unicellular organisms, it can either be binary fission, multiple fission, or budding, whereas in multicellular organisms, it can be fragmentation, regeneration, budding, spore formation, and vegetative propagation. Today's topic is sexual reproduction. It can take place in plants and in human beings. So, our discussion today will be on sexual reproduction in plants. Before we go to today's topic, sexual reproduction in plants in detail, let's have a brief introduction on what is sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction in plants and in human beings is nothing but a mode of reproduction that takes place with the involvement of two individuals of two different sexes, male and female. Let us now have a brief note on sexual reproduction in human beings. During sexual reproduction, male organisms having male sex organs produces male gametes such that sperms, which are small and motile, and the female organisms having female sex organs produces ova, which are generally large and store food. Male and female gametes fuse together to form a zygote that grows into a new organism. This is the basic process of sexual reproduction in human beings. I am not discussing about sexual reproduction in plants here, as this will be taken in detail in the following slides. Now let's move on in detail about sexual reproduction in flowering plants. The reproductive parts are present in the flower. The parts of the flower include sepals, petals, stamen, and the carpel. A collection of carpels are termed as pistil. Sepals are nothing but green structures that protect the inner part of the flower, as in bud stage. Petals are colorful and attract the insects for pollination. Now let's discuss about stamens. Stamens are the male reproductive parts and produce pollen grains that contains the male gamete. Each stamen has two parts, the filament, the stalk, and the anther, which is the swollen top part that has a large number of pollen grains. Coming to the carpel. The carpel is the female reproductive part and produces ovules that contain the female gametes. This carpel has three parts: stigma, style, and ovary. The stigma is the top sticky part, and this receives pollen grains during pollination. The style is the middle long part, and the ovary is the swollen part that contains ovules. Each ovule has an egg cell called the female gamete. This is all about the parts of a flower. Flowers can be bisexual and unisexual. Bisexual. These have both stamens and carpels. For examples, mustard and China rose. Unisexual. These possess either stamens or carpels. For example, papaya and watermelon. Now, what is pollination? Pollination is a process of transfer of pollen grains from an anther to the stigma of the flower. There are two types of pollination: self-pollination and cross-pollination. The transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the same flower or another flower of the same plant is termed as self-pollination. The transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of another flower or another flower of a different plant of the same species is termed as cross-pollination. This cross-pollination generally takes place with the help of some agents like insects, birds, wind, and water. Now, let's have a discussion on fertilization. So, now what is fertilization? Fertilization is the process of fusion of male and female gamete to form a zygote during sexual reproduction. Pollination is followed by fertilization in plants. The events are as follows. Pollen grains land on the stigma of the ovary. Pollen tubes grow out of the pollen grains, travel through the style, and reach the ovary through the micropyle. Pollen tube will have two male germ cells. Each ovule has two polar nuclei and a female germ cell, an egg. Pollen tube releases two male germ cells inside the ovule. One of them fuses with the female germ cell and forms a zygote, which grows into the baby plant such that our embryo. This fusion is termed as syngamy. The other male germ cell fuses with two polar nuclei, and the process is termed as triple fusion. So, in flowering plants, two fusions takes place during fertilization, and hence the process of fertilization in flowering plants is termed as double fertilization. So, what happens after fertilization? Let's have a discussion on the post-fertilization changes. After fertilization, the following changes takes place in the flower. The zygote divides several times and forms an embryo inside the ovule. The ovule develops a tough coat and changes into the seed. The ovary grows rapidly and ripens to form a fruit. Petals, sepals, stamens, style and stigma shrivel and fall off. The seed and its part. The advantages of a seed is to protect the future plant, its embryo. The seed has two parts, the cotyledon and the embryo. The cotyledons store food for the future plant. Embryo has two parts, plumule and radicle. The plumule develops into the shoot and the radicle develops into the root. The process of development of a seedling from the embryo under appropriate condition is termed as germination.
Now let's discuss what is reproduction. What is reproduction? It is a process by which living organisms produce new individuals similar to themselves. Reproduction ensures continuity of life on Earth. Reproduction is a bridge to hereditary transmission. It involves the continuation of characters from the parents to the daughter cells by copying DNA. Copying of DNA, even minute changes, brings about variations in the blueprint of the offsprings. Whereas the useful variations are retained while the harmful ones do not go beyond. These variations help the species to withstand drastic environmental changes, thus saves the species from becoming extinct and promotes its survival. How do organisms reproduce? Reproduction takes place by two methods, sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction. Again further, asexual reproduction is carried out by unicellular organism and multicellular organism. Whereas the asexual reproduction is of two types, unicellular organism and by multicellular organism. In unicellular organism, it involves only one parent and there is no formation and fusion of gametes. Under unicellular, we have binary fission, multiple fission and budding. When we talk about multicellular organism, we will discuss deeply about fragmentation, regeneration, budding, spore formation and vegetative propagation. Reproduction is of two types, asexual and sexual. Let's begin with asexual reproduction. Let's see asexual reproduction. It is extremely useful as a means of rapid multiplication. It is common in lower plants and animals. Different forms of asexual reproduction. Fission. The parent cell divides or splits into two daughter cells. That's binary fission. When the parent cell divides or splits into many cells, then it is multiple fission. Budding. A new organism is produced as an outgrowth of the parent body part, then it is called budding. Fragmentation. It is the accidental process when the broken pieces of an organism, that's fragments, grows into a complete organism. Regeneration. When simple animals like a hydra, planaria develop a new individual from the broken older part, it is called regeneration. It is carried out by a specialized cell which grow large number of cells. Let's move on to spore formation. Spores are small bulb-like structure which develops at the top of the erect hyphae. of the fungus plant. When released into the air, it germinates into a new individual after landing into the soil. Now let's move on to vegetative propagation. Vegetative propagation is nothing but a mode of reproduction in parts like stem, root, leaves develop into a new plant under favorable condition. Let's see the benefits of vegetative propagation. Growing banana, orange, rose, jasmine have lost the capacity to produce seeds. Plants can bear flowers, fruits more quickly than those produced from seeds. The genetical similarities maintained in the plants like sugarcane, rose, grapes by layering or grafting. Now let's move on to sexual reproduction in plants. When reproduction takes place as a result of the fusion between two gametes, one from each parent, then it is called sexual reproduction. The process of fusion between two gametes is called fertilization. The formation of gametes involves an exchange of chromosomal genetic fragments between homologous chromosomes, causing generic recombination which leads to variations. Sexual reproduction in plants mostly occurs in flowering plants. In fact, flowers are the reproductive organ of plants. When the pollen grains of a flower transfer to the stigma of the carpel of another flower, then it is cross-pollination. Pollen grains of a flower transfer to the stigma of the carpel of the same flower, then it is called self-pollination. This transfer of pollens is achieved by agents like wind, water, or animals. After pollination, the pollen grains reach the egg cell in the form of a pollen tube. Let's move on to fertilization. The fusion between the pollen grain and the female egg cell, it occurs inside the ovary. This zygote is produced in this process. The zygote divides several times to form an embryo within the ovule. The ovule develops a rough coat and it is converted into a seed. Ovary grows rapidly and ripens to form fruit, while the seed contains the future plant or embryo which develops into seedling under suitable condition. This is known as germination. Thus, we have come to a conclusion of how do organisms reproduce and particularly about plant reproduction.